Okay, in the last video, we talked about attending to things selectively, like attending to one thing among many. But what about multitasking? Can we divide our attention and pay attention to multiple things at once, like walking and chewing gum at the same time, or listening in class or a meeting while you're texting, or talking and driving, or taking a dump and Snapchatting, or studying and taking notes and watching TV and checking Facebook and eating chips and ignoring your roommates whining and glancing at incoming text notifications and thinking about your money problems all at the same time? Can we do that? And if so, how does that work? That is the topic of divided attention. And usually divided attention is investigated with something we call a dual task paradigm, having participants do two ongoing tasks simultaneously. So for example, task 1 might require reading a short story, and task 2 requires them also at the same time writing down dictated words. Or task 1 might require a verbal response when a particular auditory stimulus shows up, but also they have to pay attention because task 2 requires them to push a button when a particular visual stimulus comes on the screen. So you're simultaneously keeping an eye and an ear out for two different things. Generally in a dual task paradigm, we find that accuracy and reaction time are poor for one or both of those tasks. In other words, there's a cost, and we're generally not able to do both of those things at the same time without sacrificing some performance, perhaps a lot of performance. Also, switching from one task to another causes what we call a psychological refractory period, meaning a brief time where targets are going to be missed in the second task because you were just doing the first task a moment ago. Like if you just did the verbal response to a particular auditory stimulus, you're going to be slower to push the button when a visual stimulus happens right afterward, if that's the visual target you're looking for. In essence, there may be a kind of processing bottleneck that makes it hard to do both tasks at the same time, because when the resources are engaged for one task, it's more costly or takes time to switch to the other task. So when we investigate this from like a cognitive neuroscience perspective, maybe like scan the brains of people doing a dual task experiment, we find that, for example, language tasks have 53% less activation in language areas during a dual task condition compared to during single task conditions, where they're just doing one language task at a time. Or we find a 29% reduction of activity in areas that are associated with like mental rotation tasks, like Tetris type of tasks, when you're doing it under dual task conditions, like when you're doing something else instead of just the mental rotation alone. And even without brain scans, we can see it in performance very clearly. Like some researchers have shown it's incredibly hard to learn new information when multitasking, and studies have shown that, for example, like students who text and use social media during studying do worse afterward. By the way, if you've ever heard the idea that women are better multitaskers than men, there's actually no good data to support that. So any sex difference seems to be tiny if it exists and not consistent. We basically all suck at multitasking. And sometimes you'll even hear researchers describe multitasking as a myth, as a mistaken belief that we can do two tasks at once without sucking at one or both of them. But that refers to, something like listening to a lecture while texting. What about something more simple, like just walking and chewing gum? Surely we can multitask with something so simple and automatic as those, right? And the answer is basically yes, with some limits. So all the way back in 1976, the famous developmental psychologist Elizabeth Spelke, she published some work with some colleagues using a dual task paradigm. So, for example, they would have participants do task 1, which required reading a short story, and also task 2, which required writing down dictated words at the same time. So they're trying to kind of pay attention to the words that are being spoken that they have to copy down, and when they're not copying those down, or when they finish each one, then they're reading this short story. And they found that with extensive practice, people can often improve on a dual task paradigm, in some cases to nearly single task levels. So initially, participants, for example, they don't process the meaning of the dictated words that they're writing down, but with a bunch of practice, after enough practice, they start to actually notice things like when the words are related in some way on those dictated words, which is something obvious when you're doing it as a single task, but initially in a dual task setup, you don't notice those things. With a ton of practice, you finally start to. Basically, some things can become automated and end up taking less attentional resources when we've practiced them over and over and over again. So like the first time you're riding a bike, it takes all of your attention not to fall on your ass. After years of riding a bike, though, you don't have to pay as much attention at all to the balancing. Heck, even walking is a skill that starts out quite challenging for most of us humans, but becomes automated really early in our development. To the point, as an adult, it requires very little conscious attentional control to coordinate all the muscles, and a lot of muscles are involved when we walk. So the more a task can become automated, the more we can end up eventually doing it alongside other tasks without large impairment of performance, but only for things that really can become automated. Other things like making sense of a conversation, those are much harder to automate. And even, a professional live translator, they don't perform nearly as well on verbal dual tasks as they do on verbal single tasks, despite practicing enough to do that for a living. The other element that predicts the extent to which our performance might suffer when multitasking is not just how much practice we have, but how difficult the task itself is. So super easy tasks like chewing gum, they just don't take a lot of attentional resources in general relative to something more difficult like juggling, right? And likewise, if you compare simple like 3-item juggling, that doesn't suffer quite as much from dual tasking as a harder thing like 6-item juggling. So regardless of how much practice you have, some things are just harder than others and take more attention. But even if we could practice things enough to make them pretty automatic, there are still some hard limits on how quickly our brain can switch between those different tasks when we're doing multiple things. So let's talk about a study. It brings me to a famous study by Raymond and colleagues back in 1992. They came up with a really elegant study, a really elegant design to show this fundamental limitation of how quickly we can switch between tasks, like even at the fractions of a second mark. So this was a form of dual task paradigm that they developed, but in this case, they presented a bunch of black letters rapidly at the same location on a screen. So it goes by super fast, like 10 per second, just random letters just streaming by in the middle of the screen really fast. Like, holy crap, count to two, right? 2 seconds. And imagine that in the time it takes you to count to 2, 20 letters just flashed by on the screen, one at a time, during those 2 seconds. It's that fast, okay? And while this stream of letters is flying by at 10 every second, the participants had 2 goals, 2 tasks that they had to do as well as they could. So one, they had to identify a single white letter that would show up in the stream of black letters. And also, second, they had to report whether or not the letter X showed up in the stream after the white letter. And the X, by the way, was there only 50% of the time, not every trial. And they either, the researchers either put that X when it was there, they either put it very soon after the white letter or quite a bit later in the stream. A bunch of other letters go by and then the X shows up. So that's the setup. Letters just flying by like crazy, and you're going to have to report the letter that was white and whether an X came after it. So there's the task, okay? Now, to give you kind of a visual of this is like a diagram of the research design, just to make it more clear. The start of the trial, that's in the lower left here, so you can think of time going by as we go up and to the right. So the start of the trial, the person's just looking at a fixation point. So we know that they're paying attention to the correct part of the screen. That's when it starts. We get this stream of letters going by really fast, which, not all of them are displayed here. There would be a bunch of letters. So the crossing out means there were a bunch of letters before B and then A, but then here we get a letter in white, okay? So here at time 1, there's a white letter, which in this case is V, but it could be anything, and then a bunch more letters afterwards. And again, half the time an X showed up in those later letters at what we might call time 2. But again, time 2 could be very soon after the white letter or way later in the stream. So let's actually play along. We're going to try out a super slowed down version of this design just to make sure the idea of it is clear. So this is going to be pretty easy because it's not at full speed. But after each of these 3 trials that we try, I just want you to say the white letter and then yes or no, depending if an X came after it. Are you ready? Here we go. So you'd say T and yes, there was an X. B and yes, there was an X. And C, And again, yes, there was an X. So in all three of these trials, it's just going to repeat now, but in all of these trials, there was an X. But again, some of them, the X might be really close to the white letter, and some of them, it might be quite a bit later. That's the idea of it. But imagine it was going by way faster, 10 letters per second, instead of that super slow presentation we just saw. Now, they also did a single task version as a control condition in this experiment, where all you had to do was say whether an X showed up, but you weren't looking for a white letter at all. So we're going to be kind of comparing the dual task version to the single task version. You're always looking for the X, like whether the X is there or not. So always the yes or no part is there. And in the experimental condition, you also have the white letter to keep track of. In the control condition, you don't have to worry about that. So they've got a basic factorial design here. Like one independent variable is the single task versus dual task conditions. And then another independent variable they manipulated is just that time delay until the X shows up. Like how far into that stream of letters the X is, at time 2, basically how far time 2 is in there. And then the dependent variable is just the accuracy in detecting the X, like how well you can do this task when it's the only thing on your plate, that's the single task version, versus when you're trying to do something else at the same time. So here's their results. I want you to look at the red line first. So just looking at the red line, the red dots there, identifying if an X showed up was fairly easy. We've got their accuracy on the left here, the percent they got correct. So 100% would be perfect, and they're pretty close to perfect, right? Percent of trials they got correct, 95%. Not bad, assuming that they're doing nothing else at the same time, because this red is our single task version, our control condition. It's not perfect, but of course, this is a hard task. Like it's just a hard task to start with because of the speed. So 95% is great for the single task version. And if you look down on the x-axis at the bottom, that's how far into the stream of letters the X was. Like this is in milliseconds. So 1,000 milliseconds would be 1 full second. That means 100 milliseconds, right around here, 100 milliseconds is a tenth of a second. So with the red line here, we can see that the timing doesn't really matter a lot in the single task situation. But now look at the blue line. This is the dual task setup where they also have to identify the white letter. And with the two tasks, now identifying the presence of an X, whether the X was there or not, it's sometimes way harder. Sometimes, not always way harder. It's way harder and it messes with performance. We get worse performance here when it happens very soon after the first task has hit. In other words, after the white letter has shown up. But once a little over half a second or so has passed, around 600 or so milliseconds, suddenly then we're up to the first task not impairing the second task as much. We get basically equal performance there as we did in the single task. So the timing matters for this effect. Now they called this effect, when they discovered this fact, this slowdown when we switch between tasks, the fact that it's hard for us to switch between tasks really quick, like half second or quicker, they called this attentional blink. So our attention metaphorically blinks, kind of like our eyes, causing a brief period after detecting one target when we can't detect or identify a second. In other words, when we can't switch to a different task. This attentional blink, by the way, it basically shows there's a limit to how quickly we can switch between two different things. And a lot of what people call multitasking is really just quickly switching back and forth between two tasks. Now, there is some evidence that the attentional blink is a little bit reduced for things that are really emotionally salient, but even then, we still find the blink. And just to kind of connect this stuff, this attentional blink study, to something like cognitive neuroscience, I just want to quote this paragraph from a more recent study that applied a neuroscience angle to attentional blink. So they say, in addition to the behavioral approach, so that's what Raymond and them did with attentional blink, that's a purely behavioral approach. In addition to that, a variety of other approaches have proved useful for studying the attentional blink phenomenon. Cognitive neuropsychological investigations have revealed, for example, that individuals with lesions in the amygdala, so problems with their amygdala, fail to show a reduced attentional blink for highly emotional words, the way most of us do, right? Such as that shown by individuals without such lesions. So lesions, that's a neuropsychological approach, right? Then they say Electroencephalography, so EEG, has provided evidence that although task 2 cannot be reported on a significant proportion of trials in the attentional blink paradigm, participants nevertheless are processing task 2 to the level of meaning. So the EEG evidence, that kind of fits with what we might expect from something like Treisman's attenuator model, right? Then they go on and they point to MEG studies and fMRI studies and pharmacological studies on the role of dopamine. But anyway, the details don't matter here so much as just seeing how we can go from something like behavioral results to diving deeper by also probing the phenomenon from a cognitive neuroscience lens. At any rate, let's move on from attentional blink. Getting back to the kind of general model of divided attention that we're testing with these dual task paradigms, one way of thinking of attention is that it involves a limited pool of attentional resources. So for example, Daniel Kahneman theorized that we've got this one big pool of attention that we can allocate part of to task 1 and part of to task 2. Of course, it doesn't have to be 50-50, right? And of course, bits are probably being allocated to some background tasks that we're doing all the time, right? But the point is, we're dividing up this total pool of attention across all the tasks that we're doing right now, where each task has a particular difficulty level and a particular level of, automaticity from our previous practice that determines how much attention is required to do it well versus starting to screw up on it, right? So Kahneman's idea was that we have this kind of one big combined pool for attention, but others have, I guess, expanded on that. They've proposed since then that we may actually have separate pools specific to different modalities or different functions, like an attentional pool specific to visuospatial stuff, or to verbal and linguistic stuff, and so on. If that latter model is more accurate, then it would make some distinct predictions, right? Like using up resources in one modality shouldn't really have much effect on our performance of a second task if the second task is in a different modality, right? Because we'd be using up some of this pool and separately some of this pool. They shouldn't really interfere with each other if they're from different pools. So these two models do make pretty distinct different predictions. And sure enough, we've actually got lots of support for some version of this multiple pools model. So for example, a dual task experiment that involves one language task and one non-language task doesn't lead to much of a dual task penalty. Like instrumental music isn't as likely to mess a lot with your writing as something that has words. Whereas lyrical music or a spoken podcast at the same time as a writing task means your performance does suffer because both tasks are verbal. They're both coming from the verbal pool. Now, that means you won't absorb the podcast well, or you won't catch or understand the lyrics of the song very well if you're writing at the same time, and likewise, your writing will probably suffer. Similarly, when we have people do two visual tasks at the same time, their performance suffers way worse than if you do a dual task paradigm with like one visual task and one verbal task, suggesting these come from different pools. So something like the model on the right seems to be the closest to how it works. But the takeaway here is that our attention is limited, and a given task takes up some amount of attention from that limited pool based on the difficulty of the task, how much practice we have with it, and also things like our state of physiological arousal and other stuff that makes a task, more or less attention heavy in that moment. Now, I want to take a few minutes to talk about a real-world application of this stuff that has some life or death consequences, and that's divided attention as it applies to driving. So a lot of groundbreaking work in this area was done by a researcher named Strayer. Like in a landmark 2013 article, he showed that using a cell phone to talk to someone makes drivers miss red lights more often, and also makes us slower to brake for red lights, again, when we're on the cell phone talking to someone and driving. So we've shown a lot of this with research done in a laboratory where we can put people in a driving simulator, but we also see it in real world driving where we use cameras installed in the car to measure people's behavior as they drive around day to day. As you can see from the data here on the right, people in a normal and sober state, like just normal everyday drivers, they don't miss red lights a ton, right? That's our kind of control condition, just driving around the green bar. But when they're on a cell phone conversation, the odds more than double of missing a red light, which is pretty scary when you add that up across all the drivers that are out there. Now, the reason this is relevant to cognitive psychology is that talking on the phone uses finite mental resources, finite attentional resources that would otherwise be available for our driving. But you might object and say, no, I think their poor performance is because the person is using one of their hands to hold the phone up. So it's more about having a free hand than about attentional resources. Maybe we should just force everyone to use hands-free phones. That would save lives, right? And that's a great point, except that this happens just as much whether the driver is holding the phone or using hands-free Bluetooth. So it's not just due to one hand being busy. And honestly, this should scare you a little and make you question, legislation like requiring drivers to use hands-free technology for their phone calls, since that doesn't actually fix the issue at all, at least for phone conversations. Now, Strayer also uses this dual task paradigm of driving plus some other task to investigate if phone conversations differ from something like controlling a radio while you're driving. So here's the data. He found data that looks kind of like what we're seeing here. The left graph, the left whole half here is probability of missing a red light. And then the right graph for all these different conditions, the right graph is the mean reaction time. So on average, how long it takes you to stop for a red light. So in both cases, higher is worse. Higher means the driver is screwing up. Now look at the dark blue bars. That's single task performance of just driving. And compare it to the light blue bar in each of the situations. That would be dual task performance, doing two things at once, driving plus something else. And as you can see, for the condition of controlling the radio, we get similar performance, actually no significant difference in the single task versus dual task conditions. Adding the radio doesn't really mess things up. But then look at the bar comparisons when using a cell phone. A phone conversation does make things a lot worse, basically doubling the missed red lights and increasing reaction time by at least a good 50 milliseconds. So here's a question then. What about something like a verbal conversation with the passenger? Do you think it impairs performance like just as bad as a cell conversation? Maybe worse than a cell conversation, or not as bad? I actually would like you to pause and think for a minute about it and come up with your prediction and an argument why you think it might be one of these. So come up with an argument why. Think about that. Okay, so it's easy to think of reasons why it could go kind of either way here. For example, you might expect it to be equal since it's a verbal task either way. Same type of attentional resources being used, right? Same pool. Or you might expect it to be worse because the conversation partner is physically present and thus they're more distracting. They're showing up in more modalities than just sound. That would make sense. Or you might expect it to be not as bad if you think, I don't know, the conversation goes differently in person versus on the phone. So we have kind of plausible explanations for all three possibilities. Which is it? Well, sure enough, what Strayer found is actually talking to a passenger, it can affect driving, especially if they aren't paying attention to the road, but not nearly as much as a phone call. So on average, a phone call conversation is more dangerous than talking to someone in the passenger seat. And the reason, which we can verify by recording real conversations and people driving, seems to be that passengers are aware of the driving conditions, and so they react by kind of pausing or slowing conversation during those more complex driving situations, or potentially even like warn the driver, like stop, when someone on the phone doesn't do that because they're not aware when the driving task gets easier or harder. This is also why sometimes you're talking to a friend when you're driving, their conversational engagement kind of waxes and wanes if they're driving, right? Because you might be having an in-depth discussion. You're on the phone with them just talking about some relationship drama or something like that, but they're also trying to merge into busy traffic, or they're keeping an eye out for a specific road sign, or trying to not hit someone in the bike lane who's dodging a door opening of some parked car or something like that. So on your end, you're just talking on the phone and it seems like they're not really engaged, or their engagement in the conversation comes and goes. That's because they're driving, right? Honestly, if you care about your friends and family or the random people they might accidentally kill, you should probably minimize talking to them when they're driving if it's not essential. By the way, there has been quite a bit of research into people's driving as a multitasking behavior and their beliefs and perceptions about that. So it turns out those who use phones a lot when they're driving perceive it as being safer, a safer activity, which might just mean that those with inaccurate beliefs are more willing to then do this behavior because they're ignorant of the reality. Or it could be more like a cognitive dissonance thing. Like if you already do the behavior because it's tempting and you want to talk to your friends, whatever, if you already do that behavior a lot, you might start to perceive it as more safe than it is because you don't think of yourself as an unsafe person and you do this all the time. So it could be either of those, but we find that those who use their phone a lot do perceive it as safer. But if you ask people not about themselves, but about other drivers, turns out most people do consider other phone-using drivers to be dangerous. But even then, they think themselves as safer at it. We think we're better at it. Like, we all think we're better than others at multitasking during driving, which, by the way, is a common cognitive bias in and of itself called illusory superiority. Most drivers think they're above average, think they're superior, even though mathematically only half of us can be in the top 50% of drivers. So how the hell can more than 50% of us think that we're in the top 50%? Some people are wrong, right? Some people are overestimating. Likewise, most doctors think they're above average, even though mathematically half of doctors have to be in the lower 50%. But not many people put themselves there. People generally overestimate themselves relative to others in most facets of their lives. And that includes assumptions of how well we can handle something like driving and talking on the phone without, smashing into someone and leaving a child paralyzed. Now, in one study back in 2011, they actually found over 90% of college students admitted to texting and driving. And we know that slows reaction time way more heavily than phone conversations. So texting and driving is even more dangerous. Now, without going too much further down the driving multitasking rabbit hole, we can kind of just summarize the research with something like this. Listening to the radio or an audiobook tends to be a mild danger. It doesn't add that much distraction. One way to think of it is that it's easier for our brain to tune out the radio or to stop paying attention to the audiobook when something important happens on the road. Now, holding a conversation is a higher risk and more moderate danger, not because it keeps a hand busy, but because it uses our attentional resources. And, a social conversation is much harder to tune out than the radio or an audiobook. Again, especially if it's something over the phone where the other person doesn't know to slow down the conversation when you need to process a busy road. Meanwhile, it turns out that one of the technologies that was originally pushed as a safety feature, like voice-activated apps for kind of hearing and replying to your texts, these features are actually way more distracting and dangerous than phone calls. They're quite dangerous compared to these other behaviors. And notice, all of these dangers are without ever taking your eyes off the road. Like, they aren't about your eyes missing the input, about not seeing things, but about your brain not processing what's hitting your eyes because our attentional capacity comes from a limited pool. The driving task stimuli, those things do hit your retina. You just don't perceive them, or you don't perceive them in time to react safely. Now, obviously, if you add in something like texting or Snapchatting when you're driving, you're dealing with those attentional issues and also visually looking away from the road. And you can imagine how dangerous that is, which is why you should really wait to check texts until you get where you're going. And by the way, you might think that just, not looking at your phone when a text comes in, that makes everything fine and safe. And certainly you're safer by not looking at it and not being tempted to reply back. That's definitely true. Much safer not to look at the text. But just a side note, some research has shown that just hearing the notification sound or seeing a little notification light flash informing you of a push notification, that increases your chances of getting in an accident even if you don't look at the notification, even if you don't look at your phone. So it's kind of a little task, basically just sitting there in the back of your mind that you're going to need to check your phone later when you arrive or when you come to a stop. So your brain is kind of dedicating a little bit of attention to the phone even without looking at it, just from that notification, which is why your best bet is legitimately just put it on silent when you're driving, at least if you want to minimize your danger to yourself and others. At any rate, that's enough about divided attention. In the next video, we're going to talk about some other attentional effects, including a bit about magic, because a lot of what stage magicians do is manipulate our attention. And they do it to kind of subvert our expectations or guide our behavior toward the options they want us to choose during their performance. So the more you know about how attention works, the more you can use that knowledge for good, evil, or just for fun.